Good, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Mr. Kelly. Thank you very much for being here. I have a question about federal monies. I know that federal monies have maybe dried up a bit, but I know that since 2009 Tiger grants, the federal government has dispersed $4.6 billion for the repair of bridges and tollways and roadways. Do you know if we've gotten our fair share, if California's gotten our fair share of that money?
Specifically with respect to Tiger grants, you know, I'm not as familiar with those being utilized for those purposes. Often they're for projects that are either projects relative to trade corridor improvements or projects that have multiple benefits like transit-oriented development or those kinds of things. Between the state and local partners, regional and local partners, we apply for about 4 or 5 of those every year, and we usually get a couple. I can come back to you with specific numbers on that. I don't have it here today.
That'd be great. I'm just curious if the federal government is doing their part to help us out as well.
Well, I can't resist the opportunity to just comment on, you know, on the federal process with respect to transportation funding has been extraordinarily challenging in the last several years. We have not had a multi-year reauthorization of transportation funding in Safety Lou was the last one, I guess. So several years. The last one that was passed was in 2012, which was MAP 21. It was only a 2-year program. It offered no new money, but several policy changes. And so we are pushing, and Malcolm has led an effort with stakeholders in California to communicate to the federal government the need to get back to the multi-year reauthorization of funding for transportation. And unfortunately, I think at last count, Congress has passed something like 34 continuous resolutions to move and just continue to fund months or weeks at a time and not do a broad program. Okay. So that's a challenging for all of us.
Got it. I'm just hoping that we can access those funds. It sounds like you are trying to do the best you can.
And we will report back to you on
specifics. Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kelly, I had a question about the way that the proposed $500 million a year revenue increase due to the gas tax stabilization and indexing for inflation and the diesel tax increase. Can you walk us through how that was calculated?
Yes. In the chart that in this book that we provided to the committee, there is a chart that's been provided to us by the Department of Finance that does a 10-year detail on each of our funding programs. We did a look back. First, I should say that under current law, due to something called the gas tax swap that was initially passed in 2010 and then subsequently passed in 2011, each year the Board of Equalization does a look at excise gas tax revenues, estimates what the revenue would be had sales tax still been in place, and then adjusts that excise tax either up or down based on what sales tax should be. That's done annually. In some years when gas prices are high, that number has gone up. I think in one year it went up to 21 cents a gallon. And some years when gas prices are low, that excise tax has dropped significantly. In the most recent year, it was dropped 6 cents by the BOE just to do that adjustment. I would say as an observation that not many people in the transportation world get much satisfaction out of that process. I would say when the BOE has adjusted the money down, like they did last year, there's been a lot of hand-wringing about the impact on the State Transportation Improvement Program, the STIP, and money's available for other transportation purposes. And in other years when it's gone up, I think the BOE doesn't love raising that tax.
Yeah, I don't think you get a lot of disagreement on this panel.
Right.
And I see the chart that you're talking about, but that chart shows us what the tax would be and not how the total is calculated. And my concern is this. It seems to me like you are simply projecting that petroleum usage in California will remain constant over the 10-year window that you're looking at. And yet we know that a stated goal of the administration is to actually reduce petroleum usage by 50%. And the Air Resources Board actually has projected petroleum and diesel usage figures projected out for this time period. And if you if you take those numbers and you plug it back into this model, you don't actually get $500 million a year of increase. In fact, you get a net decrease by the end of the 10-year window. So my concern is this. I know we're all incentivized here to examine sustainable future funding sources for transportation. And my concern is that given the fact that we're trying to incentivize people to reduce petroleum usage in the future, and given the fact that we're trying to get people out of petroleum-based vehicles and into zero-emissions vehicles, I'm not sure that gasoline and diesel excise taxes should be a part of that sustainable funding plan. Would you agree with that?
I would say that an important part of our program is the emphasis we have on the vehicle use fee, which generates $2 billion year over year. And we focused on that because we recognize that there has been in recent years a downward projection on the consumption of gasoline in California. However, I would say when you're doing a projection over multiple years, particularly a decade or longer, it's a little bit dangerous to over-project one way or the other. One thing that I've seen in just the last 5 years, for example, is when the economy was really struggling, we had a big reduction in vehicle miles traveled. Now that the economy is coming back, vehicle miles traveled are rising. So the assumption in this is that we will have certainly flat gasoline consumption over time. Whether it goes up or down over that, there will be modifications and changes, for sure. But the estimate is based on a flatness that is fair based on recent volatility we've seen.
All right. So I understand. So, I mean, we have a kind of a disagreement on this issue because the Air Resources Board does not share that projection. They'd like to see petroleum usage decrease. So that's why I question whether or not a gas tax or a diesel tax is an appropriate source of sustainable future revenue. But thank you very much for your testimony.
I think I would add just one other comment on that the gas tax issue, in terms of that base adjustment we're making, is going to be adjusted annually by the BOE. And so we say today it's a 6-cent thing because the BOE today is at 12 cents. But it will go up in some years going forward, and it will go down in some years going forward. I wouldn't call that a brand new tax. I would say it's one that we're putting in place now, as opposed to waiting over the 5-year period where we'll probably get back to 18 cents at some point, because the history shows it does.
Sure, I'd agree with you. However, indexing for inflation is certainly an increase.
That's true. And indexing in for inflation is because flat excise taxes do not keep up with the cost of construction. And the result of that is that every so often we have to come to the legislature and try to get an adjustment in the gas tax. And the last time we did it was 25 years ago. And it's probably a better idea to have those revenues flow in a way that they could adjust to costs to build transportation projects.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll explore that more deeply if you like, Assemblyman. We can get more information. Okay, Senator Cannella. And
yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Kelly, thank you for being here. You mentioned in your remarks that we need to have a bipartisan approach, and I agree. It needs to be a bipartisan approach. And I would argue what you presented isn't necessarily a bipartisan approach. A bipartisan approach would be both sides coming together, give and take on both sides, and ultimately we come up with a solution that everybody either likes or everybody's a little frustrated with. But this is your proposal, and this is the administration's proposal. It really doesn't include some of the key things that we've talked about as Republicans that I think are very fair items to consider when we're looking at putting higher taxes on Californians. For example, you mentioned a constitutional guarantee on the fees, but I think that's already there. What we're talking about is a constitutional guarantee on all transportation funding, which includes the weight fees. So I think that's important that that's part of the proposal. Secondly, back to the weight fees, we do have $1 billion in weight fees that is paid from folks that use our roads. I think before we ask them to pay more, I think that money needs to go to transportation before they pay more. Also, we are collecting, based on the numbers that I've heard, about $1.9 billion a year on cap and trade for fuels under the cap. If we're paying that, I think if road improvements, mass transit, all the things that we can do to reduce greenhouse gases, I think that those should be directed to transportation projects. Also, CEQA reform, I think we've talked about CEQA reform. It's probably been talked about since CEQA was passed many years ago. But if we're going to be paying more money or we're going to be directing money to transportation projects, it needs to be more than just the state highways. I was talking to a local county public works director in my county, Stanislaus County, And he mentioned that if they were able just to do a NEPA document that met CEQA requirements and not have to do both documents, that would save a lot of time and a lot of money. So I think we need to expand it beyond just state highways because local government's having a difficult time as well. So I think there's a lot that we have to do, but again, I am totally supportive of a bipartisan approach, but it needs to truly be a bipartisan approach. And honestly, if we would have had this when we were talking about it, when Chairman Bell and Chairman Frazier were doing the hard work of trying to make something happen, I think this would have been a great tool. But as it was, we got a one-page document at the end of session that really kind of monkeyed up everything that we were doing, quite frankly. So I hope now that we've got the administration's proposal, I hope everybody's open to changes, and I look forward to that bipartisan approach.
Thank you, Senator. Assemblywoman.
Senator, in response to that, Senator, I'd just make a couple of comments. First, I think we've labeled our summary Governor Brown's transportation proposal. I think I claimed it as the administration's, and I'm very proud of the document. What I intended to reference is that we did talk to all the caucuses starting in June, July, even before that, and this does include elements that came from all caucuses. There's funding issues, there's reform issues, and if I pulled out, for example, the Assembly Republican plan, there's a lot of policy objectives that were in that plan that we are giving a nod to as something that we ought to do something on. So I want to first make that point. Secondly, the constitutional protection that we've included in our program applies specifically to the the vehicle fee that is the road improvement charge under this plan that is not constitutionally protected for Section 2 purposes of the Constitution today, which are transportation improvements. So we do that in our constitutional amendment. The gas and diesel tax, as you rightly pointed out, are already protected under Article 19. Secondly, there's been a lot of conversations about the weight fee issues. It's gone back and forth. We may have a policy difference on that one. Ours is that weight fees being used to finance, fund transportation projects in California is appropriate. The legislature voted on that in 2011 with overwhelming bipartisan support. And so we think that's an appropriate use of weight fees to use that for bond costs on transportation projects. With respect to cap and trade, you're right that the cap and trade dollars some are being used for transportation now. Last year we just did a $225 million grant program out of my agency for public transit improvements. And under this proposal we would spend $500 million more on transportation improvements. And then finally, just a quick comment on the timing. Look, I agree with you that we had some awkward conversations during the regular session on how to move forward on this. And that's for a lot of reasons. In part, a recess right after we called the special session, leadership changes in 3 out of the 4 caucuses. There's a lot of moving parts that we've all had to work through. But we have presented this document in an effort to be constructive. I don't expect that this would be the final piece. I hope, though, that just as you alluded to, it could be a document that we could use as a tool to go forward. And that's why we're here today. We want to get to a constructive bipartisan solution.
If I could just note that on the weight fees, I think the general obligation bonds, when the public voted on it, they expected it to be a general obligation paid for by the general fund. Yes, we were in very difficult times, and we made some tough decisions because we had massive cuts. We wanted to fund the programs that were most critical to the state of California. But if you look at the revenue, it is way up. And it's unfortunate that we have such a low dedication of general fund dollars to something that's so important to Californians like transportation. So it just can't be new taxes over new taxes over new taxes. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have that discussion. We should have that discussion, but it's the last part of the discussion. There's so many other things we should be doing. And when these weight fees, I mean, that's a big deal for as a Republican, for me, it's a big deal that all money that's currently being paid for transportation should be directed. And if there's still a shortfall, then we should have that discussion. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Assemblywoman Landis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, thank you all for coming in and being so candid in your comments to our questions. I was at a transportation hearing yesterday in Pasadena with Assemblyman Gomez, and we had It was about 3 hours, I think, and we had a lot of productive discussion about the effects of neglecting our transportation, what that has on our economy. So it's not just about moving the people, moving the goods. It is about the economy. I have to be honest with you, though, Mr. Kelly. I feel like you have kind of gone back and forth in your presentation of what the administration's plan is with respect to some of these taxes and the effects that they will have. That being said, when you talk about the cap and trade money that will go, or that is going toward transportation, I just want to clarify something. It goes to transit, not transportation, as we're discussing today, right? I mean, there is a distinction between the two.
Yeah. Well,
when you say, would you agree with that?
No.
No.
And
okay.
I wouldn't agree with that.
Explain the distinction.
Well, the only point I want to make is that we have a comprehensive proposal before you.
Right.
That doesn't just fund roads. It funds roads, it funds local streets, it funds transit, it makes money available for trade corridors. It's comprehensive. With respect to the cap and trade revenues, it's true that cap and trade, the first call on the cap and trade revenues is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So elements like active transportation programs and public transit, because they carry more people in a singular vehicle, have pretty good numbers to show on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So cap and trade dollars today are going for those things, and we are proposing to add to that, including a $100 million program here for what we would call a low-carbon road improvement project. And so we are looking to expand.
I'm sorry, could I stop you right there?
Sure.
Low carbon road improvement?
Yes.
Okay. Can you just define that for those who might not know what that is?
Under the program, we'd make money available for mostly local governments who will apply for doing things like improving safety between cars, vehicles, and bicyclists and pedestrians. So it could be separated bike and pedestrian lanes. Could be the use of roundabouts on streets as opposed to full intersections for easier, improved flow of vehicles that reduce greenhouse gas. It could be traffic synchronization, traffic light synchronization projects. So there's a lot of elements that you can do to improve flow and reduce greenhouse gas emissions that we think we ought to test.
Okay, and I understand that. I think, though, in the broader conversation about this, what folks are probably looking for are infrastructure improvements that are more tangible, I guess, than adding bike lanes. I don't disagree with you that helps the overall improvement of the situation, but I think what we're talking about here is the actual disrepair that we find our roadways in and what we're going to do about that. I do want to go back to the point that Assemblyman Obernolte made, though, and just have you just touch on that one more time to clarify about the gas excise tax and the diesel excise tax, which are assumed to be fixed consumption, which I believe you agreed that that's a moving target, right? And so we are encouraging people to drive less or at least drive more fuel-efficient vehicles. So that tax would, common sense would dictate that tax would go down realistically if we go by what the ARB requirements are and what the governor's plan is. So I guess my question to you is, having contemplated that, where is the money? Where are we going to make up the money?
Well, again, I would say that there's competing pressures on what happens with gasoline consumption. You're right. We're seeing greater efficiency of vehicles. We think that's a good policy thing. That puts downward pressure on consumption. Population growth and increased vehicle miles traveled put upward pressure on consumption. And the only point that I was making earlier is that there was a deep trend for about 4 or 5 years during the downward cycle of the economy where vehicle miles traveled was also dropping greatly. That seems to be turning now that the economy has come back. And so there's a little bit of an upward pressure. I think what might be better to do is we did use one estimate in here. If there's a better estimate we should use to get the numbers, I'm open to considering how we should better project that. I just think with multi-year projections, none of them are going to be exactly dead on, and you try to do what you think will happen with growth and pressure over time. And so we used a flat one. If it should be something different, we should talk about that.
So, Co-Chair Gomez has a question.
Thank you. One a comment and then a question. This is actually where we're starting the hard work of finding consensus, where we have both the Senate and the Assembly, Republicans and Democrats, hashing out these issues. This is kind of where the starting, in my opinion, the continuation of the starting point from earlier in the year. So I think it's good what we're vetting out some of these concerns. When it comes to the fact that we're trying to reduce gas consumption at the same time trying to increase revenues, that's two, I think, worthy goals, but we just have to take that into consideration as we model out. But it's good to know that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle believe that we're going to actually achieve gasoline reduction consumption in the next 10 years. Quick question: when it comes to the weight fee issue, Ms. Bosler, can you go into a little bit more about the weight fee issue? Is there a way to do to protect that? What happens if we do, or what kind of impact it would have in the general fund? Just kind of, I know you kind of hinted at that in the beginning of your comments.
Yeah, no, I did want to clarify that. So debt service, general obligation bond debt service is actually been quite a fast-growing component of our budget. And in 15-16, we'll be spending over $5 billion on debt service. So this is all to service bonds that have been sold over the years for various things, transportation being one of them. So a policy was made several years ago to dedicate the weight fees to paying the general obligation bond debt service of the transportation bonds. We think that is a very sound policy. Those projects are solely for transportation. To switch and push that weight fee back to other transportation expenditures would, before the debt service on the transportation bonds that were issued is completely paid off, would have a $1 billion hit to the general fund. So while we currently have a projected operating deficit of $2.8 billion, in the short term, that the $1 billion would add to that. And also, I wanted to note, and I had failed to mention this in my earlier comments, but this also, our out-year projections also assumed that we would be able to achieve the managed care organization tax as well, which is another $1 billion that we currently don't have, we have not been able to pass, so that's also an additional $1 billion hit to our overall budget situation. So the bottom line is to redirect the weight fees away from the debt service on transportation in the short term, while we are continuing to spend down the transportation bonds, would be a $1 billion hit to the general fund.
So it's not like the weight fees are going to health care?
No, they are not. They are being used for the debt service payments for the transportation bonds that were sold and projects that have been delivered.
Thank you so much.
Senator Cannella, you had a comment.
Yeah, I'm just curious. So general obligation bonds are not unusual in the state of California, right? You said $5 billion. Can you name a single other special fund that pays off a general obligation bond?
General obligation bonds, the $5 billion is just the debt service payments. That has nothing to do with the.
What other special funds are leveraged to pay off?
I'm not aware of other funds. These funds were an eligible use for the debt service payments on transportation. They are specifically being used for transportation debt service. They're not being used for other parks bonds, resources bonds, water bonds, other bonds that have also been sold over the last several years. But they are being used for transportation purposes. I'm not aware of any other special funds specifically that are paying for GO bonds.
Thank you.
I acknowledge that my Republican colleagues have put that on the table. Okay, I just want to say that first. One of the things when I looked at the mistakes that we kind of made when we were involved in the discussion 25 years ago. And by the way, folks, I was there. I represented the League of California Cities on the task force that worked on the last gas tax increase for the league account, so you can blame me, I guess. Whatever. You can blame, yeah, I look too young, yeah, come on. You're kidding. But I was the chairman of the League of Cities Transportation Committee at the time, and we worked, Brian was there and several people in the audience. I won't mention their names. But the mistakes we made was we did not include an element for inflation on a long-term basis. We didn't realize that it would take 25 years to revisit whether or not we had enough revenue. Okay, that was a mistake. We didn't put an ongoing kind of a process in terms of that. And the second mistake is we didn't anticipate fuel efficiency, I'd say, changes that occurred. And the Republican colleagues raised that issue, and the fuel efficiency has had a dramatic impact on revenue here. And if you look ahead, it's going to have a real dramatic impact. It's really going to have a dramatic impact. We did not look into that adequately at the time, you know. So if you had to admit, okay, what could have we done? I tried to analyze how much it had an impact, just the fuel efficiency part. And I'm not certain if this is accurate, but if you had 12,000 miles driving a car, that's just typical vehicle, drives about 12,000 miles a year, okay? That's the average, okay, they say. Back in those days, the average car would get like, this is just statistics I've found. I don't know if this is national, 23 miles to a gallon. Now it's up to about 30. So the difference between that is about buying, what, 521 gallons versus buying 400 gallons. So you're buying only 400 gallons with the typical car, whereas in those days you were buying 521 gallons. And so when you look at the amount of tax revenue, you're actually, in terms of the vehicle, because we haven't changed the gas tax since, it's less money. It's actually less money. So I think we look to the future, we can't make the same mistakes we made in the past, you know. And so I think I think we need more research on that. I don't know if my numbers are correct. I think somebody that's more qualified than me that did on the back of an envelope using internet numbers probably can come up with some truer numbers on that. But I think the concept of not making the same mistake is very important. I think the governor's proposal tried to do that, but I think when we finalize what we're doing, we have to sort of get to a point where, as a policy, we're recognizing the very fact that fuel efficiency is part of the future that we're trying to deal with here. I mean, it's just going to be here. We're going to have, and the cost of the roads, interesting enough, don't change. They just deteriorate at the same level as they deteriorated back then, probably faster, because we have more cars now driving on the roads. So the cost of deterioration is about the same, but less revenue. So I think we have to have some kind of long-range approach on that, and that's going to be very important. I don't know if my numbers are right.
Yeah.
I'd like to have maybe and I think some of the Republican Assembly members raised the issue. So let's get some more information on that for us.
Happy to look at that, Mr. Chairman. I would just comment that some of the downward pressures, again, are also offset by population growth and increased vehicle miles traveled overall. That also are elements of
wear and tear is
consumption.
more because you have more people.
And I'd also just say that, you know, that's one reason we really the heart of the funding matter is not relying on the gas tax.
Right.
We've looked at a vehicle fee, much like your legislation has, as another way to fund transportation improvements that has a user nexus but doesn't rely on gasoline consumption.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We'll turn to our next. If there's other questions, we'll turn to our next panel, if that's okay. We'll
Thank you,
go
Mr.
ahead
Chairman.
and keep on schedule here, and we'll go to the legislative analysts and welcome. Thank you all for coming.